When considering your preference flows on your how to vote, it's important to consider them carefully to make sure you don't accidentally re-elect a Liberal. In 2022, there are high-profile, well-funded climate independents running in blue-ribbon Liberal electorates, such as Wentworth in New South Wales and Goldstein in Victoria. This presentation is really geared at those electorates. So if you are deciding preferences for the Greens or Labor in one of those electorates, then this presentation is for you. Traditionally, you may have chosen the order of your preferences purely on policy, but in this election, you need to think tactically. I'm going to show you how, if Greens and Labor do a preference swap, then they risk re-electing the Liberal. However, if they both preference the Independent before they preference each other, then we are maximising the chance of the Independent taking the seat. Okay, so I've just invented a typical Liberal in a city electorate. It's been safe and it's only ever returned Liberals in its history. I'm going to show you how two different preference flows can produce two entirely different results. We will go into the detail in a minute, but what you'll see here is that two different preference flows can produce two dramatically opposed results. In the first example on the left, the Independent stays in the two-party preferred, and the final result looks like a likely comfortable win for her. In the second example, the Independent gets knocked out, and the really comfortable win is for the re-election of the Liberal candidate. So I'm going to show you what happened and how you can avoid that second outcome. I'll show you the 2022 in a minute, but here's just a couple of slides to show you how this imaginary electorate voted in 2019. The Liberals won on first preferences. The Greens had the next best vote. The Australian Electoral Commission will still do a two-party preferred, even though the Liberal is already elected. The Liberals do even better with One Nation and Palmer United added to their totals. The Greens vote is now the sum of their vote and Labor. At over 60%, this is considered a very safe seat by the Australian Electoral Commission. So I'm going to show you how it's really important that you consider the preference order on your how to vote. I'm going to show you that if the Greens and Labor do a preference swap, they risk accidentally re-electing the Liberal. Now assume that all voters follow the how to vote, which you and I both know they don't. But getting your head around all the different preference flows is hard enough without adding complexity. So this is a simple example which gives us an exaggerated idea of what would happen in real life. The Independent is not recommending preferences. She wants to appeal to both Labor and Liberal voters and doesn't want to alienate one group or another. She may agree with the Liberals economically, but wants climate action and a decent anti-corruption agency. The Liberal primary vote has been smashed since the last election. They've lost 21% to the Independent, but they are still in front. Labor and the Greens have also lost a few percent. Labor and the Greens have swapped preferences. Labor worry that the Independent is anti-union, and the Greens see her as too right-wing on everything except climate. The Liberals are now on 41% after One Nation and United Australia preferences. Now the preference swap has the Greens pulling ahead of the Independent. That means all the votes for the independent will be passed either to the Greens or the Liberal. Remember, she had know how to vote, and many of her voters always voted Liberal before this election. Independent voters who put the Liberals before the Greens on their voter slip have given the Liberal Party 60% in a two-party preferred. The Australian Electoral Commission would classify that as a safe Liberal seat still. I'll show some data later from the last election in Warringah to show you that the independent voters do go on and preference the Liberals in these blue ribbon seats. The Liberal being re-elected is the exact situation which we are trying to avoid. Okay, now we're going to show what will happen if Labor and the Greens preference the independent before they preference each other. What will happen here is the independent won't get knocked out. At this point, it's the same as you saw last time. Labor being slightly less than the Greens are about to be distributed. But this time, they've preferenced the independent, so their votes will go to her rather than adding to the Green vote. This result is dramatically different. The Labor vote has managed to pull the independent slightly ahead of the Liberal. When the Greens are distributed, she will win comfortably. So the independent is elected on two-party preferred, and this is a safe seat according to the Australian Electoral Commission. It's amazing to think how something that looks like a landslide win for the Liberals could instead be a landslide win for the independent, all because of different preference flows. Labor and the Greens helped elect the independent by preferencing her ahead of each other. If you are Labor or the Greens, play it safe. Put the independent ahead of each other on your how to vote. But you may say this would never happen. I'm sure the independents would preference Labor or the Greens. After all, they've shown they are sick of the Liberal. Or you may think this scenario would never happen in real life. The order wouldn't make that much difference. Well, I'm going to show you some actual data that shows that this scenario is very real. First of all, I'm going to take the data from the Australian Electoral Commission website because it shows the actual results for 2019 when Zali Steggall famously beat Tony Abbott. Fortunately for us, they also published a two-party preferred with Labor against Tony Abbott, not just the final real one with Zali. Okay, there's two graphs here. The one on the left is Liberal versus Zali, and this is actually what happened. Zali beat Tony Abbott comfortably, 57 to 43. We know that sent a message that Liberal voters care about climate change, and it did force the government to start considering things like having a net zero target. The Australian Electoral Commission also published a two-party preferred against the Labor Party candidate, and in that situation, Tony Abbott wins. Instead of getting 43%, the two-party preferred, he gets 52%, and that means he would have won the seat. Can you imagine Tony Abbott still being in Parliament, or the message from the 2019 electorate being that people don't actually care that much about climate change? The repercussions would have been huge. In short, a lot of Zali voters put Tony Abbott ahead of Labor and the Greens on their ballot. There's no reason to think that electors in Wentworth or Mackellar or Goldstein would act differently. Okay, here's some examples of real polls taken around the 10th of April, just before the election was called. I got these from the excellent Poll Bludger website, which is run by a brilliant analyst called William Bow. I strongly recommend this site. In Curtin, he shows the combined Labour and Greens vote being well ahead of the Independent. In Mackellar, he's got Labour on 18%, which is only 6% behind the Independent. He didn't publish the Greens vote, but in both these scenarios, the Greens and Labour combined vote could get ahead of the Independent. The Greens and Labour must preference the Independent ahead of each other. An independent candidate mustn't get distributed.